0-day brief.
Think about the last time you forgot a password. You probably didn't think twice about hitting forgot password. You enter your email. You get the link. You choose a new password. It's done. It's one of those parts of an application we barely notice anymore. Now imagine that same button is the way an attacker gets in. Not by guessing your password, not by stealing your session, not by tricking one of your employees. They just ask the application to reset a password, and the application gives them something much more valuable instead. Administrator access. That's what happened to Metabase. And the really uncomfortable part is this wasn't some obscure internal tool. Metabase is sitting in front of databases. It has the credentials to those databases. So when an attacker gets administrator access to Metabase, they may not just get your dashboards. They may get the keys to what's behind them. And here's where this story gets worse. This wasn't the first time Metabase had a critical pre-authentication flaw. It was the third. 2021, 2023, and now 2026. Different bugs, different endpoints, same basic boundary. The attacker doesn't need to be inside before they reach it. And this time, the attack wasn't theoretical. Metabase's own cloud was hit first. So let's look at how a password reset request turned into a way through the window. So let's slow this down and look at how the break-in actually worked. Imagine you're checking into a hotel. The registration form asks for your name and your room number. You hand it back, but you've added one more line at the bottom. Midnight room service, filet mignon, 2 orders. The clerk doesn't reject the form. The software doesn't know that extra line shouldn't be there. And later, the kitchen reads it as an instruction. That's essentially what happened here. Metabase's password reset endpoint expected 2 things: a token and a new password. The attacker sent a third field, user-id. That field wasn't supposed to be there. But the application merged the request with its authentication result, and Clojure's merge function kept the extra field instead of throwing it away. So the attacker's user-id survived. And then they put something much more interesting inside it. SQL. The application eventually handed that attacker-controlled value to HoneySQL, Metabase's query-building library, using a marker that means, essentially, this is raw-SQL, run it. And that turns a field that should have contained a user ID into an instruction to the database. That's the bug. A password reset form became a SQL injection point, and it didn't require a password to reach it. Now look at the severity. CVSS 10.0. Maximum. No authentication. No user interaction. And the endpoint is reachable from the internet on an exposed instance. The flaw has apparently been present since version 58, when the authentication module was refactored. And then came the really bad part. Metabase disclosed on August 6th that its own cloud had already been attacked with the bug as a 0-day, before there was a patch. And the attack leaves a very useful fingerprint. The password reset request returns a 400. Then almost immediately, a session check returns a 200. 400. Then 200. If you see those together, Metabase says to assume the instance was compromised. Now the timeline matters. KiloCode says its instance was compromised on August 2nd, during a 4-hour window. It was alerted 4 days later. Metabase disclosed on August 6th. The CVE was published on August 10th. CISA added it to the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog on August 11th, with a required date of August 14th. And by then, public proof-of-concept code was circulating. So there wasn't some nice, clean gap between disclosure and exploitation. The window was already moving. And then there's the part that makes the blast radius much bigger than someone got into Metabase. Metabase holds credentials for the databases it connects to. So if an attacker gets administrator access to the application, they may be able to steal those stored database credentials. That's the important distinction. They're not just looking at the dashboards. They're potentially getting the keys to the databases behind those dashboards. And the victim list shows what that can mean. Framework said names, Login IPs, addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses were accessed. N8N said an attacker pulled 136 customer records, including 5 account passwords stored as hashes. Kilo Code said Slackbot integration tokens were exposed during that 4-hour window. Tally and Checkly disclosed their own incidents. 5 companies, 1 shared dependency. Now let's zoom out. Because honestly, the SQL injection isn't the most interesting part of this story. The pattern is, think about an apartment with 1 window that keeps getting broken into. The first time, somebody uses a screwdriver. The landlord replaces the lock. The second time, somebody uses a crowbar. Another lock. Then the third time, the attacker doesn't even touch the window. They come through a nearby door connected to the same alarm system. Different trick. The same weakness. The owner keeps fixing the thing that was just exploited. But the underlying exposure is still there. That's the concern with Metabase. 2021. CVE-2026-72898. An unauthenticated flaw in the custom map feature that could expose internal files. CVSS 10.0. 2023. CVE-2026-72898. An unauthenticated setup endpoint that allowed command execution. CVSS 9.8. The DreamBus botnet went after exposed instances in the wild. And now 2026. CVE-2026-72898. The password reset flow. CVSS 10.0. Different endpoints. Different bugs. Same basic problem. The attacker doesn't need to be authenticated before reaching a part of the application that ultimately protects very valuable things. 3 times. 5 years. And that's the design lesson. Metabase sits directly on top of your databases. It stores their credentials. It makes those databases easy to query. That's incredibly useful. But it also means the application becomes a kind of window into everything behind it. And that window has a surprisingly large pre-authentication attack surface. So when another maximum-severity flaw appears in that surface, the impact isn't just another CVE number. It's another route to the keys. And this is where the story connects to episode 42. Different technology, different vulnerability, the same shape. In episode 42, we looked at a Windows driver that kept producing the same bug family, and an attacker who kept coming back to the same weak seam. Here the seam is different, but the lesson is similar. A component can keep accumulating security debt around the boundary nobody is supposed to cross. And Metabase's exposure makes that especially important. Wiz Research measured roughly 13% of cloud environments running self-hosted Metabase. About a quarter of those were fully internet accessible, and around 2,500 instances were indexed on Shodan. Then public proof-of-concept code appeared within days. So ask yourself what happens when you combine a 10.0 vulnerability, no authentication, a widely deployed application, thousands of exposed instances, and working exploit code. At that point, the interesting question isn't whether somebody will try it. It's how quickly. So what do you actually do? Start with the easy part. Patch. Metabase released fixed-point releases across affected major versions 58 through 63. If you're below version 58, you weren't exposed to this particular flaw. If you're in the affected range, move to the latest fixed-point release for your branch. And if you can't patch immediately, the vendor's workaround is straightforward. Block the password reset endpoint at the edge. But don't stop there, because Metabase's own guidance assumes something important. If that password reset endpoint was publicly reachable, treat the instance as potentially compromised. Not just vulnerable. Compromised. That changes the response. Revoke active sessions. Delete the session table entries. Review administrator accounts. Look for API keys you don't recognize. Rotate the credentials for every connected database. Then check those databases. Look for queries that don't belong. Look at activity history. Look for sessions that nobody on your team started. Why? Because the fix closes the window. It doesn't tell you whether somebody already climbed through it. And if an attacker had administrator access, even briefly, the thing you need to worry about isn't just the Metabase instance. It's everything Metabase could reach. That's why the database credential rotation matters so much. You're not just changing the lock on the window. You're changing the keys to the rooms behind it. Before you do all of that, establish exactly what you're running. Check the Metabase version. The vendor lists the minimum safe release for each affected branch. If you're below 58, this particular CVE doesn't apply. If you're running an affected version and the reset endpoint was exposed to the internet, assume exposure until you've established otherwise. And there's another detail that's easy to miss. The same security advisory covered 3 vulnerabilities. This password reset injection is CVSS 10.0. There was another unauthenticated injection through publicly shared dashboards, also CVSS 10.0, and a lower severity flaw allowed a logged-in user to read the entire application database. 1 advisory, 3 doors. So don't patch only the headline CVE and call the job finished. Close all 3, and then look for the attack fingerprint. A password reset request returning 400, followed by a session check returning 200. Back to back. That's the signal Metabase published. If you find it, don't just patch. Patch, rotate, audit. Because at that point, you're no longer asking whether someone could get in. You're asking whether someone already did. Okay, let's bring this together. The headline is simple. A 10.0 SQL injection in Metabase's password reset flow. No login required. Exploited as a 0-day against Metabase's own cloud. Added to CISA's known exploited catalog within days. And 5 companies have disclosed incidents connected to the campaign. But that's not the part I'd remember. I'd remember the pattern. 2021, 2023, 2026. 3 maximum severity, pre-authentication flaws in 5 years. Different endpoints. Different techniques. Same window. And the reason that matters is structural. Metabase is trusted with database credentials by design. It's supposed to sit close to the data, which means a flaw in the unauthenticated boundary isn't just a flaw in the application. It's potentially a path to everything behind it. So what changes after this? Patch Metabase. If you can't patch, block the password reset endpoint. And if it was exposed, assume the window may already have been opened. Rotate the database credentials. Review administrator accounts. Audit API keys. Check the logs for that 400 then 200 pattern. And don't stop at the headline CVE. Because 1 security advisory covered 3 doors. The important lesson isn't that Metabase had another critical vulnerability. It's that a tool sitting between users and your databases has now demonstrated the same dangerous pattern 3 times. 1 bug class, 3 maximum severity flaws, 5 years, and this time, the vendor's own cloud was the first one through the window.
Thank you for listening to 0 Day Brief.